I have stood a great many nights at the lantern gate, and most of them have run together in my memory the way water runs together in a trough. But there is one I could walk you through minute by minute, even now, with my joints gone to rust and my eyes no good past the length of this room. It was the coldest night of that or any year I served, and it was the night I learned what a man is really guarding when he stands a gate. I should tell you first about the gate itself, because you cannot understand the rest without it. The lantern gate was the north door into the king's house at Brannock, and it was called the lantern gate for the iron lamp that hung in the arch above it, an old thing the size of a wine cask that had not gone dark in living memory. It was not the grand gate. The grand gate faced south, toward the city and the river and the road the carriages took, and that was where the visiting lords came in under the painted arms and the trumpets. The lantern gate faced the moor. Behind it lay the kitchens and the woodyards and the laundry sheds and the long stone corridor the servants used, and through it came firewood and milk and the night soil carts and the men who emptied them. It was a working door. The great lords of Brannock passed through it perhaps once in their lives, and only then by accident. I liked it the better for that. A man who guards a working door sees the true running of a house. He learns which scullery maid is sweet on which footman, and which carter waters his ale, and which of the great household secrets are kept by the people who scrub its floors. He learns, too, the small daily kindnesses and cruelties that never reach the painted halls, and he learns to keep his face still through all of them, which is the first and last lesson of the work. I was Corporal Jonas Reeve in those years, and I had stood the king's gates for 11 winters. Before that, I had been a soldier of a different kind, in a war I will come to, in a country far enough north that the cold there made the cold at Brannock feel like a thing you could reason with. I had come to the king's house the way a great many of us came to it, as a man with a steady hand and a closed mouth, and nowhere in particular he wished to be. The household took such men gladly. We made good sentries. A sentry's whole trade is to want nothing, expect nothing, and stand. That night the storm came down off the moor a little after the supper hour, and by the time I took the watch at the turning of midnight, it had become the kind of weather a man does not forget. The snow did not fall so much as travel sideways, in long ropes and sheets, and the wind came with it in a sound that was almost a voice, a low steady moan in the arch of the gate that rose now and then to a shriek and then fell back. The cold was a living thing that night. It found the gaps in a man's collar and cuffs and worked at them like fingers. The iron lamp above me swung and rattled on its chain, and the light it threw went wild across the snow, so that the whole white world seemed to lurch and steady and lurch again. I will tell you how a guardsman dresses for such a night, so you understand what came after. Over my shirt I had the wool tunic, and over that the long gray watch cloak that the men called the bear, for its weight, and for the way the snow piled on its shoulders. I had the tall fur cap, and the wool gloves under the white dress gloves, and good boots that I had greased that very evening against the wet. I was as well armored against the cold as any man at Brannock, and I will tell you plainly that within the first hour of that watch I was cold to the bone in spite of all of it. That is the measure of the night I am describing. A man dressed as I was dressed, standing as I was trained to stand, was cold. I thought of the carters out on the moor road and hoped they had the sense to stop where they were, and I thought of the men I had buried in the snow long ago, and then I put both thoughts away, because a sentry who lets his mind wander on a hard night is a sentry who lets his blood slow, and a man whose blood has slowed does not always notice when he begins to die. There was a warming room behind the gate. It was a small stone cell, hardly more than a closet, with a narrow grate and a bench and a store of split wood, and the rule was that a man on the long winter watches might step into it for a quarter hour in each hour to bring the life back into his hands, so long as the gate was barred, and a second man stood ready. But I had no second man that night. My relief had taken a fever 2 days before, and the sergeant of the watch, a decent man named Halloran, had been unable to find another to send out into such weather at such an hour, and so I stood the lantern gate alone, with the warming room behind me unused, because a man cannot warm his hands in a closet and guard a gate at the same time, and the gate came first. That was the rule, and I had never in 11 winters had cause to question it. I will come back to that closet. It matters more than anything else in this story. I had been on the watch perhaps an hour, and the worst of the cold had settled into me and become a kind of grim companion, when I first saw the figure in the white. I did not trust my eyes at first. The snow plays tricks on a man who stares into it too long. It makes shapes out of nothing, and a sentry learns to distrust the corners of his sight. But this shape did not melt away when I looked at it square. It came on, low and slow and staggering, out of the swirl of the moor, and it was small. That was the thing my mind caught on before anything else. It was small. It was the size of a dog, perhaps, but it walked upright, and it fell, and it got up, and it came on toward the swinging light of my lamp the way a moth comes to a candle, with no will in it that I could see beyond the pull of the light itself. I left my post. I want to be honest about that, because everything that followed turned on it, and because I have heard the story told since in ways that make me out a finer man than I was. I did not weigh the rule against the duty and choose nobly. I saw a small thing dying in the snow, and my body went toward it before my mind had finished a thought, and I unbarred the wicket in the great gate and stepped out into the full teeth of the wind, and the cold out there, past the shelter of the arch, took the breath clean out of me. It was a boy. He had got to within a few yards of the gate and gone down on his hands and knees and could not rise again, and when I reached him and got my arms under him, he weighed almost nothing, and that frightened me more than any weight would have. He was perhaps 8 years old, perhaps 9. It was hard to say, for the cold and the hunger had pinched his face down small. He wore a thin scullery smock and a pair of clogs and nothing else, no coat, no cap, no gloves, and the snow had got into all of it and packed itself against his skin, and his lips had gone the color of a bruise. He was not crying. I have learned that the ones who are still crying are the ones you need not fear for yet. It is the quiet ones, the ones gone past crying into a kind of dull animal patience, that you must move quickly for. He was very quiet. I carried him in through the wicket and barred it behind me with one hand, and I stood a moment in the shelter of the arch with him against my chest, getting my bearings. The right thing, the thing the rule would have had me do, was to send word to the sergeant of the watch and let the house decide what was to be done with a strange child found at the gate. But word would take time in such weather, and the boy did not have time. I could feel through my cloak how little of him there was, and how cold, and I knew the look of a person the cold has nearly finished, because I had seen it on grown men, and I had seen it on friends, and I had once stood in a white field at the wrong edge of the world and watched it take a column of soldiers one by one over a single night, and been able to do nothing, and carried the doing nothing with me ever since. So I broke the rule a second time. I carried him into the warming room. I am not a clever man, and I have never been a gentle one, but I knew a few things about bringing a body back from the cold, and I set about them. I did not put him near the grate at once. I had learned long ago that you do not thaw a frozen man fast, that the fast way kills him, and that the slow way is the only true mercy. I got the wet smock off him and wrapped him in my own watch cloak, the great gray bear of a thing which swallowed him whole, and I sat down on the bench with him in my lap, and I held him against the warmth of my body, and I rubbed at his back and his arms through the wool, slow and steady, and I talked to him. I do not remember what I said. It was the kind of low, foolish talk a man uses on a frightened horse. Words that mean nothing and are not meant to. The voice is the thing, the steadiness of it. After a while his shivering, which had stopped entirely when I found him, started again, great racking shudders that shook the whole small frame of him, and I was glad of it, glad past telling, because a body that has stopped shivering has given up the fight, and a body that starts again has decided to live. He came back slowly. The bruise color went out of his lips. His eyes, which had been half shut and dull, opened and found my face and fixed on it with the wary, measuring look of a child who has learned early that grown men are mostly to be feared. I held still under that look and let him take my measure. After a long while he spoke, in a voice no bigger than the scrape of a mouse. "Are you going to send me back?" I did not know yet what back was. "Back where?" I said. He did not answer that. He only watched me with that wariness, and I understood that the question of where was the whole of it, that wherever back was, it was a place he had walked out into a killing storm in a thin smock to be free of, and that he had rather have died in the snow than returned to it. That told me more than any answer would have. I have seen a great deal of the world's cruelty in my years, most of it done by the powerful to the weak in the daylight where everyone could see, and I had learned to read its marks. There were marks on this boy, not the storm's marks, older ones, a yellow-green shadow of an old bruise along his jaw, a way of flinching when my hand moved that he could not help and did not know he did. I did not need him to tell me back where. I only needed him to know the answer to his question, and I gave it to him. "No," I said, "I'm not going to send you back." I had no right to say it. I was a corporal on a gate. I had no authority over a single soul in that house save the carters I waved through and the beggars I waved off. The disposing of a runaway scullery boy was a matter for the steward, and the steward, I would learn before the night was out, was the very back the child had fled. But I said it, and I meant it, and a part of me that had been cold for a very long time, longer than that night, warmed a little in the saying. His name, I got out of him by slow degrees, was Wren. Just Wren. He did not seem to have another, or if he did he had forgotten it or never been given it. He was a turnspit and a pot scrubber in the great kitchen, one of the small army of children that such a house swallows up to do the lowest work, the children nobody owns and nobody misses, who sleep on the kitchen flags by the dying fires and rise before dawn to lay them again. He had been at the king's house since he was small enough to be carried there, by whom he did not know, and he had run that night into that storm, because of a thing that I will tell you when I come to the man who caused it, because the two belong together. I had got him wrapped and warm and his color back, and I had got a little broth into him from the small pot I kept on the grate for my own watches, and he had fallen at last into a heavy thawing sleep against my chest when I heard the carriage. You will say a man cannot hear a carriage over a storm like that, and on most nights you would be right. But the wind had dropped for a moment, as it does, into one of those sudden lulls that make the silence ring. And in the lull I heard the iron-shod wheels on the cobbles of the inner yard and the blowing of cold horses and the voices of men. And I knew that someone had come in by the grand gate from the city and was being brought round. And I knew with the certainty of long experience that the night, which I had thought was about to let me alone, was only beginning. I will tell you now about Lord Garrick Thorn, and I will try to tell it fairly, because I have had many years to be angry at him, and the anger has long since burned down to something cooler and more useful, which is understanding. Thorn was a great man of the kingdom. He held wide lands to the west and a seat at the king's council, and he had come to the king's house that season as a guest of long standing, for the winter court, and he had been at the feast that evening in the grand hall until the small hours. He was a man of perhaps 50, big through the chest and going to fat, with a fine head of gray hair and a fine red face, and the kind of easy, carrying voice that men born to be obeyed never lose. I had seen him about the house that fortnight, always at a distance, always at the center of a knot of lesser men who laughed when he laughed. He had never once looked at me. There is no reason he should have. I was furniture to a man like Thorn, a thing in a red tunic that stood by a door, no more a person to him than the door itself. He came to the lantern gate by accident, and that accident was the hinge of the whole night. The grand gate, I learned afterward, had a drift against it taller than a man, for the wind that night had heaped the snow against the south face of the house, and the grooms could not get his lordship's carriage out through it to the lodge where he was housed, which lay beyond the north wall. So they had brought him round through the inner yards on foot, his lordship and his man and a footman with a lantern, to go out by the lantern gate and round to the lodge along the sheltered side, which was the shorter and the only passable way. It was a small thing, a drift of snow, But for the want of a clear gate, a great lord's whole future was undone that night. And I have thought since that this is how most large things turn, on some small accident that puts a man where he would not otherwise have been, at the hour his true nature is asked for. I heard them coming down the servants' corridor, his lordship's voice raised and slurred with wine and ill temper, complaining of the cold and the drift and the incompetence of every man who served him, and the footman murmuring, and the lord's own man saying nothing. I had laid Wren down on the bench, still wrapped in my cloak, and I had stepped back out to my post at the gate, because whatever was coming, it would find me at my post and not in a closet, and I had barred the warming-room door behind me so that the boy at least would have the small mercy of being out of sight. I stood in the arch in my tunic alone, with the snow piling on my shoulders where the cloak had been, and I waited. They came out through the inner door into the shelter of the arch in a gust of warmth from the house, and a smell of wine and a clatter of feet. The footman with the lantern, and behind him the lord's man, a lean closed-faced fellow, and behind him Lord Thorn, filling the doorway, red and grand and swaying very slightly, pulling his fur collar up around his ears and glaring out at the storm beyond the bars as though it were a servant who had displeased him. "Open it then," he said to me, not looking at me. "Open it and be quick. I'm half frozen as it is." I did not open it. I will tell you why, and the why is the heart of the matter. The gate was the king's gate, and I had my orders for it, and my orders that night, given me by Sergeant Halloran at the turning of the watch, were to pass no one out into the storm after the supper hour without a writ from the watch, because 2 carters had already been lost on the moor road that week, and the watch would lose no more souls to the weather if it could help it. The order was a kindness dressed as a rule, which is what the best orders are. To open that gate and put a man, even a great lord, out into that night, even to walk the few hundred yards to the lodge, was against my orders, and beyond that it was against my judgment, for I had just carried in off that more the proof of what the night could do. "My lord," I said, "I'm ordered to pass no one out after supper without a writ from the watch. The storm's killed 2 men this week already. If your lordship will wait in the house, I'll send word to the sergeant and he'll send you out safe with a lantern man, or find you a bed inside till it eases." He looked at me then. It was the first time he had ever looked at me, and I watched him decide in the space of a breath exactly how much I was worth, which was nothing. The red face went redder. "You'll open this gate," he said very quietly, which is how that kind of man speaks when he is most dangerous, "because I am Lord Thorn and you are a soldier on a door, and I have told you to. I'll not be lectured on the weather by the help. Open it." "I can't, my lord," I said. "Not without the writ. I'm sorry for it. I'll send for it now." I had thought that would be the end of it, that he would curse me and go back inside to wait, as a sensible man would have done. But Thorn was past sense, with the wine in him and the cold, and the long humiliation of being walked through the kitchens like a tradesman. And he was a man who had never in his life been told no by a person of no consequence and could not bear the taste of it. He took a step toward me, and as he took it, the warming-room door, which I had barred but which the old bar did not always hold true, swung open in a gust, and the lantern light fell across the bench, and across the small wrapped shape of Wren asleep on it in my gray cloak. I saw the Lord see him. I saw the wine-fogged eyes fix on the child, and narrow, and I saw a kind of pleasure come into the red face, the pleasure of a man who has been balked and has suddenly found someone smaller than himself to spend his temper on. "What's that?" he said. It was not a question. The footman, who knew, made the mistake of answering. "It's one of the kitchen boys, my lord, the turnspit. There was a great to-do at the feast, his lordship will recall, when the 3rd remove was late, and Master Crail the steward swore he'd have the skin off the boy that let the fire die, and the boy ran. They've been hunting him this hour." So that was the back. That was what Wren had walked into the storm to be free of. A fire had died, a dish had come late to a feast, a great man's pleasure had been a moment delayed, and a steward whose whole standing rested on the smoothness of such things had promised a small child a beating he had every reason, from long experience, to believe would be a true one. And the child had reckoned the storm the safer of his 2 deaths and gone out into it. I have turned that over many times in the years since. The casual size of it, the smallness of the cause, and the largeness of what it nearly cost. "Crail wants him, does he?" said Lord Thorn, and he smiled. "Well, here's the runaway found." He turned to me, and now there was something almost merry in his cruelty, the cheer of a bully who sees his evening rescued. "You, soldier, you'll not open the gate for a lord, you say. Very well, open it for that. Throw the little rat back out where you found him, and we'll let the steward and the storm settle which of them has him. Go on." I did not move. "Did you hear me?" he said. "I heard you, my lord," I said. "Then do it." I have stood very still in my life when stillness was hard. I stood still under fire once, on a wall, for the better part of an hour, because moving would have shown the enemy where the line was thin, and men I loved were behind that line. I have stood still while a man screamed insults into my face an inch from my eyes, paid by a wager to make me break, and not broken. But I do not think I have ever held myself as still as I held myself in the arch of the lantern gate, with that order hanging in the cold air between us, because everything in me wanted to move. Everything in me wanted to take that big red grand man by the front of his fine coat and put him out through the wicket myself, and bar it, and let the storm he wished on a child have him instead. I could have done it. I was the younger and the harder man for all his size, and there was no one there to stop me. The wanting of it was so strong that my hands ached. But a sentry who breaks is no sentry, and a man who answers cruelty with his fists has handed the cruel man the one weapon he understands and lost. I knew that. It had been beaten into me in a harder school than the household, in that white country to the north, where I had learned that the men who survive are not the men who feel the most or even the men who fight the best, but the men who can hold a thing they have decided is true against everything the world does to make them let go of it. So I held. "No, my lord," I said, "I won't." The merriment went out of his face. "You won't," he repeated. "The boy stays in out of the storm," I said. "If your lordship wishes the steward sent for, I'll have him sent for, and the boy given over to the house in the morning when there's a light to see by and a fire to question him at. But I'll not put a child out into a night that's killed grown men this week. Not for you, my lord, and not for any man. I'm sorry to refuse your lordship, but on that I'll not be moved." I would like to tell you that he heard the sense of it or the weight of it and stepped back. He did not. A man like Thorn in his cups, refused twice in one night by a creature he reckoned beneath his notice, does not hear sense. He hears only that the order of the world in which he speaks and lesser men obey has been broken, and he reaches for the thing that will mend it. For a man like that, the thing is always power. He has no other tool. "You know who I am," he said. "I do, my lord." "Then you know I can have you off this gate by morning. I can have you out of this house and onto the road by morning with no character and no pay owed, and there's not a great house in the kingdom will take a man Lord Thorn has turned off. You'll be a beggar by the spring. I've done it to better men than you for less. You'll obey me, or I'll see you ruined. That's the whole of your choice, soldier. Choose." There it was, the whole weight of him brought to bear, and I will not pretend to you that it meant nothing. I was not a young man. I had no family and no land and no trade but this one, and a soldier sentry turned off without a character at past 40 is a man with a short and ugly road ahead of him, and I knew it. He had named my ruin exactly, and he had named it true. He could do every word of it. There was a long moment, in the cold and the lamplight, when the whole rest of my life hung on what I said next, and I felt the hanging of it. And then I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that there was no choice in it at all. There had not been from the first. A man spends his whole life building the thing he will not trade, stone by stone, mostly without knowing he is building it, and then one cold night the world comes and offers him everything he has to take the keystone out, and he discovers that he would sooner be ruined whole than spared with a hole in him. I had buried men in the snow once and been able to do nothing. I had sworn over those graves, a small private soldier's oath that I had never spoken aloud and had half forgotten I had sworn, that I would never again stand by and let the cold take someone I had it in my power to keep. The boy asleep on that bench was someone I had it in my power to keep. The Lord could have my livelihood. He could not have that. Then I'm ruined, my lord, I said. The boy stays in. We stood a moment longer. I think he could not quite believe it even then. And then a thing happened that I have come to think of as the truest measure of the man, truer than all his rage. He did not strike me. He did not order his man to take the boy himself. He weighed it, I saw him weigh it, and he decided that to soil his own hands or his man's on the matter was beneath him, that I was not worth the scene, and that the surer and the colder revenge was to leave it all till morning and ruin me at his leisure with a word in the right ear, and have the boy whipped into the bargain, and lose nothing himself but a night's sleep he would take in the house after all. He turned, without another word to me, and went back in through the inner door with his man and the lantern, to find a warm bed under the king's roof, and left me to the storm and my refusal. The door shut. The warmth and the wine smell went with it, and I was alone again at the lantern gate with a sleeping child, and the certain knowledge that I had thrown my whole life away over a turnspit boy I had known for 2 hours, and the strange thing, the thing I have never been able to explain to the few I have told this to, is that I was not sorry. I was afraid, in a low practical way, of what the morning would bring, but I was not sorry. I went and barred the warming room door true this time, with a wedge under it, and I looked at the boy sleeping, and I went back to my post, and I stood the rest of that long watch in my shirt and tunic with my cloak around a stranger's child, and I have never in my life felt the cold less. The hours after that were the longest I have known, and I will not pretend they were not hard. The storm did not ease. If anything, it worsened toward the dead middle of the night, and the cold came down to a degree I had not felt since the war. Standing agate in such cold, in a tunic, without the watch cloak that was at that moment keeping a child alive, is a thing the body protests with a steadily rising voice. The shivering started in me as it had started in the boy, great waves of it, and I let it come, because the shivering is the body's own fire, and a man fights the cold by feeding it, not damping it. I moved when I could, small movements, working my fingers and toes, shifting my weight, the things a sentry learns to do without breaking the line of his stand. I went into the warming room twice in the worst of it, for a few minutes only, to bring the life back into my hands at the grate and to look at the boy, and each time I barred the gate first and stood listening at it the whole while, because the night was not done with me, and I knew it. For the night had a second visitor, and I had been waiting for him. Master Krail, the steward, came down to the lantern gate perhaps 2 hours before dawn, and he came alone, and he came knowing the boy was there, for the footman had carried the tale up into the house as footmen do, and word had reached him that his runaway was found and being sheltered by a mad corporal who had refused Lord Thorn himself. Krail was a different sort of man from Thorn, and in some ways a worse one, for Thorn's cruelty was the careless cruelty of a man who has never had to think about smaller people at all, while Krail's was the deliberate cruelty of a man who has spent his whole life among them, and made of their fear his comfort. He was lean and gray and soft-voiced, and he ran the underhouse of the king's home through a fine cold web of fear that the great folk above never saw and would not have cared about if they had. The children of his kitchens feared him the way children fear the dark, wholly and without question, and he liked it so. He came to the inner door of the arch, and he did not come through it. He stood in it, out of the worst of the cold, and he spoke to me through the dark in his soft gray voice, and what he wanted was simple. He wanted the boy. The boy had shamed him before the feast, before Lord Thorn, by letting a fire die, and a steward's whole standing is the smoothness of the house, and a smoothness that can be broken by a child is no standing at all, and he meant to mend his standing the only way he knew, which was to make an example of the child so terrible that no other child would ever dare the same. He did not say all of that. He said only, soft and reasonable, that the boy was his to discipline, that I had no business in the matter, that I would do far better for myself to hand the runaway over quietly, and let the underhouse settle its own affairs as it always had, and forget the whole night had happened, and that he, Crail, would even see to it that no word of my refusal of Lord Thorn reached the wrong ears, if I were sensible now. It was a shrewder attack than Thorn's, for it offered me my safety back in exchange for the child, and it dressed the giving up as no more than minding my own place. And I will tell you honestly that a tireder, colder, more frightened man than I had become by that hour might have taken it. The boy was not mine. The world had run on the Crails and their kitchens long before me, and would run on them long after, and one corporal standing in a cold gate could not change that. And what was I, in the end, but a man throwing his living away to delay by a few hours a thing that would happen anyway? But that is the great lie the world tells the men who guard its gates, and I had heard it before in that white country, and I knew it for what it was. It is not true that one man standing cannot change a thing. It is only true that he cannot change all of it. He can change the one thing in front of him. He can keep the one fire from going out that is within his reach. The whole of the cruelty of the world was beyond me that night, and is beyond me still. But Wren was on the bench behind me, and Wren was within my reach, and a man is not asked to save the world. He is asked to hold his own gate. He's given over to the house in the morning, Master Crail, I said. In the daylight, before the sergeant of the watch with a record made of it, not before, and not into your hands in the dark with no one by. I'll answer for that to whoever you like in the morning in the light, but the boy stays where he is till then. Crail stood a long while in the doorway. He was not a man who raged. He was too cold for that. He only looked at me out of the dark, and I felt him filing me away in the long ledger of grudges that men like him keep. And then he said, very softly, that I was making a great mistake, and that men who made such mistakes did not last in great houses, and that he would remember my name. And then he went back inside. I had now been threatened with ruin by the two most powerful men in that house below the king himself, and I had refused them both. And I stood in the cold knowing that, whatever the next day held, the life I had built at the king's house over 11 winters was almost certainly ended, that I would be turned off by morning between the Lord's word and the steward's, and that the only thing I had to set against the whole wreck of it was a sleeping child who would never even know what his keeping had cost. It should have felt like loss. I have tried many times to make it feel in the remembering like loss. It never has. The truth, the strange soldier's truth of it, is that those were among the cleanest hours of my whole life. I knew exactly what I was for. There is a peace in that which most men, who spend their lives uncertain what they are for, never taste. I tasted it at the lantern gate in the cold, with everything I owned about to be taken from me, and I would not trade the memory of it for a comfortable old age. Wren woke once more before the dawn. I heard him stir and went into him, and he was frightened to find himself in a strange place, and frightened more when he remembered. And I sat with him and got the rest of the broth into him and told him, because he asked again, that no one was going to send him back, and that I would be there in the morning, and that whatever happened, the storm could not have him now. He looked at me with those wary measuring eyes, learning slowly, against everything his short life had taught him, that a grown man's word might be a thing he could lean on. And then he asked me why I had kept him, why I would not give him up when the great Lord had told me to, when the steward had come. It was the question Thorn had asked, and Crail had asked, in their way, and the boy asked it plainest of all, in his small scraped voice, and I found I owed him a truer answer than I had given either of them. I told him a little of the white country, not the worst of it. He was a child, and there are things a child should not have to carry. But I told him that I had been a soldier in a cold place once, and that the cold had taken men I had charge of one winter night, and I had not been able to stop it, and that I had promised myself over their graves that I would never again let the cold have someone I could keep from it. And I told him that he was someone I could keep, and so I had kept him, and there was no more to it than that, and that he owed me nothing for it, and was to forget the whole of it as soon as he was warm, because a kindness that asks to be remembered is half a debt and no true kindness at all. He did not forget it, but that is the end of the story, and I am not there yet. The Queen Dowager came to the lantern gate at the very first gray of the dawn, and that, I have always believed, was the one piece of pure good fortune in the whole night, the one thing I did not earn and could not have arranged, and I have given thanks for it every day of my life since. I should tell you who she was. King Haldane's mother she was, the old queen, widow of the king before, and she was past 70 then and bent with her years, but she was the truest soul in that whole great house, and everyone in it below the salt knew it, though few above did. She did not keep to the painted halls. She had a way of going about the house at strange hours on her own small business, on the arm of one ancient waiting woman, looking into the corners the great folk never saw, the kitchens and the laundries and the sick rooms of the underservants, and she missed very little. The storm had kept her wakeful, she told me afterward, and she had risen before her household and gone walking the cold corridors as was her habit, and her walking had brought her, by what I can only call grace, down the servants' passage to the lantern gate at the hour the night's whole reckoning was waiting to be made. She came out into the arch on her woman's arm, a small bent figure in a great fur robe, and she found me at my post, blue with cold in my shirt and tunic, and she found the warming room door open and the boy sitting up on the bench wrapped in a soldier's gray watchcloak twice too big for him, and she stopped, and her old sharp eyes went from the one of us to the other, and she understood, I think, the shape of the whole thing in a single look, the way the very old and the very wise sometimes do. "Corporal," she said, "where is your cloak?" It was not the question I had braced for. "Round the boy, your grace," I said. "And how long has it been round the boy?" "Since a little after the turn of midnight, your grace." She looked at me a long moment, at the snow that had piled and frozen on my bare shoulders where the cloak should have been, at the blue of my hands, and then she did a thing that no one in that house had done in all my 11 winters. She looked at me as a man, not as furniture, not as a thing in a tunic by a door, as a man who had stood a whole killing night in his shirt to keep a stranger's child warm, and she let me see that she saw it. "Tell me the night," she said, and sat herself down on the cold stone bench beside the boy as though she had all the time in the world, and I told her. I told her plainly and short, the way a soldier reports, leaving nothing out and nothing colored. The boy out of the storm, the bringing in, the Lord's coming and his order, my refusal, the threat of my ruin, the steward's coming and his offer and my second refusal. I did not soften Thorn, and I did not spare myself. I told her I had broken the rule of the gate twice to bring the boy in, and that I knew it and would answer for it. She listened without a word, with her old hand resting on Wren's wrapped shoulder, and the boy, who feared all grown folk, did not flinch from the touch of that one, which told its own story. When I had done, she sat a while in silence. Then she said half to herself, "He let a fire die, and for a fire dying 2 great men of my son's house would have had a child whipped or dead in the snow on the coldest night in 20 years. And she looked up at me, and 1 corporal would not. Well," she rose with her woman's help, and she was no longer the gentle old wanderer of the corridors. There was something in her then of the queen she had been. "Stand your post, Corporal Reeve. The day is coming, and it has a great deal to settle. You will not be moved from this gate by anyone, on my word, until I send for you. Do you understand me? Not by anyone." "Your grace," I said. And then the morning came, and with it the reckoning, and I will tell it quickly, because the long night was the heart of it, and the morning was only the world setting itself to rights. The Queen Dowager did not let the matter be hushed, which is what a smaller soul would have done, and what Thorn and Crail both, when they woke, urgently desired. She had the whole of it brought into the light. She sent for her son the king, and she sent for Lord Thorn, and she sent for Master Crail, and she had them all come down to the lantern gate in the cold gray morning where the thing had happened, with the snow still heaped against the bars and the boy still wrapped in my cloak on the bench, so that they should see it where it stood and not be able to make it into something smaller in a warm room with words. And she had me tell it again, the whole night, before the king, plainly, as I had told her. And then she had the footman tell his part, and he told it true, for he was more afraid of her than of Thorn, and there was no part of it that could be made to mean anything but what it was. I watched Lord Thorn's face through it. He had come down expecting, I think, to have a troublesome corporal turned off and a runaway whipped, and the whole tedious business behind him by breakfast. He understood very slowly that the ground had shifted under him, and that he stood in the cold morning light before his king and his king's mother, revealed as a man who had ordered a freezing child put out into a storm to die, for sport and for spite, because a soldier had told him no. There is no rank that survives that, told plainly in the open. The great carrying voice did not carry now. He tried once to speak of the corporal's insolence, of a guest's right to obedience, and the old queen turned her eyes on him, and he stopped. The king, who was a decent if not a strong man, and who loved his mother and feared her judgment, looked at Lord Thorn as a man looks at something he has found under a stone, and that look was the end of Garrick Thorn at the court of Brannock. He was not arrested. Great lords are not arrested for cruelty to kitchen boys, and I will not pretend to you that the world is just enough for that. But he was finished. He left the king's house that same morning before the roads were rightly clear, rather than stay another hour under that judgment, and he was not asked to the winter court again, that year or ever, and the tale of the night went with him wherever he went, as such tailies do, carried by the very servants he had never once seen as people. A man may keep his lands and his title and lose every other thing that made them worth the having, and that is what became of Lord Thorn. The last I heard of him he died some years later on his western estates, alone but for paid men, an old lord no one came to see. I take no pleasure in it, but I will not say he was wronged. Master Crail fared no better and deserved it as much. The Queen Dowager, once her eye had fallen on the underhouse and its running, did not look away again, and what she found there in the weeks after, the fear, the small cruelties, the children worked past bearing and beaten past reason, was more than even that hard old place could be let to keep. Crail was turned off without a character before the month was out, which for a steward is its own kind of ruin, and a better man set over the kitchens in his place, and the worst of the underhouse's small daily cruelties ended with him. Not all of them. The world is not mended so easily as that, but the worst. And Wren, the boy was not whipped and was not sent back and was not made a turnspit again. The Queen Dowager took an interest in him. In the quiet, stubborn way she took an interest in the small, forgotten people of that house, and saw him put to honest work above stairs with a decent woman over him, and fed, and in time even lettered a little, which for a child of the kitchen flags was a destiny beyond any dreaming. I will not tell you he grew up to be a great man, for he did not. The world does not often hand out such endings, and I distrust the stories that say it does. He grew up to be an ordinary good one, a steady man with a trade and in time a family, and that is a finer thing and a rarer one than greatness, and it is more than the night nearly left him. I had him by me sometimes in the years after when he was grown, and we did not often speak of that night, for there was no need. But once, a long time after, when he had children of his own and I was an old man past my service, he told me that he had never in his life been able to bear a fire left to die in a grate, that he would cross a room to feed it, that his own children laughed at him for it, and that he had never told them why. I knew why. We did not need to say it. As for me, I was not turned off. The Queen Dowager saw to that, and the king would refuse her nothing, and the man who was to have been ruined by mourning was instead, by her order, given a warmer post and a sergeant's pay before the winter was out, though I did not ask it and would as soon have stayed a corporal at the lantern gate, which was the truest post I ever held. I stood the king's gates a great many years more, and stood them well, and grew old in the work, and there is little else to tell of my life that is worth the telling. But I have never forgotten what I learned in that one cold night, and it is the only piece of wisdom I have that I think is worth handing on, so I will set it down here and be done. They train a guardsman to hold his post. They tell him 1,000 times until it is in his bones that he does not leave the gate, that he does not break the line, that he stands though the heavens fall, and all of that is true, and I would teach it to any young man the same. But there is a thing they do not tell you that you have to find for yourself. On some cold night when the whole weight of the world's power comes and stands in your gate and orders you to do a cruel and easy thing, and the doing of it would cost you nothing and the refusing of it would cost you everything. And the thing is this: the post is not the point. The discipline is not the point. A man does not hold a line for the sake of the line. He holds it for the sake of what is behind it. All those years of standing still, all that training and not breaking, in wanting nothing and answering nothing and being moved by no man. It is not so that you can be a fine unmoving thing in a red coat for the lords to walk past. It is so that on the one night it matters, when something small and freezing and worth more than your whole life comes out of the storm and reaches the bars, you will have the strength to stand between it and the cold, and not be moved. That is what the stillness is for. I did not know it for 11 winters. I knew it by the dawn. The lamp above the lantern gate has not gone dark in living memory. I used to think that was only an old custom, a thing the lamplighters kept up because it had always been kept. I think now I understand it better. A light is left burning at a gate so that the lost, out in the dark and the cold, will know there is somewhere to come, and someone there who will not turn them away. That is the whole of the trade, when you strip the tunic and the medals and the drill away from it. A man stands at the gate, and he keeps the lamp lit, and he does not let the cold have what comes to him out of the dark. I kept mine. On the coldest night of that or any year, with everything I owned set against it, I kept mine. And I have been a great many things in my life that I am not proud of, but I have that one night, and I would not give it back for all the warm and easy years a wiser man would have bought with it.